Arash Azizi is a senior writer for the Independent Persian. Here in New York, Amy Holmes is a political commentator and columnist for the Swiss weekly Die Weltwoche. From our studios in Washington, D.C., Stacey is a national security consultant and former U.S. State Department official during the Obama administration. And joining us from Beijing, Einar Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator. Welcome to all of you. Let's start in Beijing with Einar Tangen. Einar Tangen, of course, this speech, in everything that's taking place here in New York, is being seen throughout the world. But here in the United States, the Washington Post described the speech, President Trump's speech, as one of the harshest critiques of globalism. What did you make of it?
Well, it was a scripted red meat commentary, obviously given to make Donald Trump feel strong. Facing domestic problems now with an impeachment inquiry, he's going back to his old script. That is, double down, try to look or make it seem that to his base, that the reason people dislike him is because he's standing up for America. In essence, the world is burning, and Donald Trump just poured more gasoline on the fire.
What do you make of the fact, Einar Tangen, that, again, he talked about globalism, he talked about national sovereignty, he talked about America first?
Well, these are his, his hit points. These are the things that he wants the conversation to be about. He's going to, go back to Washington and say, look, I told the whole world how it was and how we are going to protect ourselves. This, he believes, is his strong suit. So this was for the domestic audience. It was not for the people there. Much like his other speeches at international events, it has never been about offering, any kind of compromise. It's been about doubling down and making sure that they know that his idea is the law of the jungle, a return to a time when those who are most powerful can rule and take what they want.
Amy Holmes, as Einar Tangen says, this was red meat for the base. And if we listen to the speech, if we really looked at it, it was vintage Trump, wasn't it? It was another expression of his America First doctrine. Should we be surprised by anything in it?
No, I don't think that there was anything remotely surprising about his speech. These are the themes and the doctrine that he campaigned on in 2016 that were found to be very attractive to 63 million voting Americans who were tiring of our Middle East engagements that seem endless and unproductive. And once, becoming president, becoming inaugurated, he has said repeatedly that his doctrine is America first, but not America alone. And also in his speech, he talked about working with other governments on some of what he considers to be his administration's priorities. For example, LGBT rights all around the world. This is something that his ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, of course, has been advocating. And he talked, of course, also about religious freedom and how 80% of the world's population lives in countries without religious freedom. And of course, that would take multilateral action in order to change that. I guess I would disagree that there's the sense that his foreign policy is in conflict with the idea of multilateral action. We know from 2 world wars, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, that in military conflict, for example, that when we're pursuing our own interests, that's often, cheek by jowl, side by side with other nations pursuing the same goals. Certainly foreign policy critics will, ask if Donald Trump's administration is in fact securing the United States, is in fact looking after our interests properly, and I think there's a lot of room for debate on that front.
All right, let me bring in Jeff Stacey and get his view. Jeff, the president said, and I'm quoting here, the globalist worldview had what he called a religious pull on past leaders that forced them to ignore their national interests. I mean, don't you find it, firstly, an irony that he made that speech at the UN, an international body that was founded on the concept of multilateralism?
There you are. In fact, you had a whole assembly of other world leaders united in their opposition to this president and his own worldview, which does not accurately describe the world in which he lives or the rest of us live in any way, shape, or form. The guest who just was speaking and defending him is quite inaccurate, to quote times when we were with our allies and our allies were with us in a way that is completely contrary to how they view the United States because of this president right now. So he really was the ultimate cat among the pigeons today, except the pigeons are actually getting along quite well, and they're no longer afraid of the cat.
All right, let me get Amy's response to that. Amy, go ahead.
Oh, well, as I say, President Trump has his foreign doctrine is America first, but not America alone. I think that a lot of his critics would say that he has a bit of a naive view, which we did hear in the speech at the UN today, of flattery of foreign leaders. For example, he mentioned by name the president of China, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, as if those sort of personal relationships and personal dealings will be able to advance his agenda. Critics on the right and the left would say that's a rather naive view and doesn't really understand all the dynamics at play.
All right, I have Arash right here with me. Arash, what do you make of what Amy just said, that it may be America first, but it's not America alone?
Well, the facts are clear. On multilateralism, Donald Trump left the Iran deal, which was a multilateral. Not only he left it, he basically didn't even try to work with the European partners. I mean, later on, of course, they've been forced to work with America, because I think one thing that has become very clear is that the preponderant power of America means that even when you get someone like Trump who does whatever he wants, other powers are forced to work with him. He left the Paris climate agreement, and he had America leave the UN Human Rights Council, which he didn't have any problem quoting on from today. So I think it's very clear that he has not have a multilateral approach, and that has been especially true in case of Iran. And if you talk to any European diplomats here, and that's what they're complaining about, that they have a US that is unpredictable and that doesn't even try to really work with them.
But looking more broadly at this, Arash, and this is where he may be different from his predecessors, in that he said that he wants to limit US military engagement around the world.
Well, I'll say two things. Number one is that we have to actually look at the facts. So it is true that he has spoken about this, but actually US's, by sheer number of actual military presence, not only it hasn't reduced, it actually has increased. If we actually look at, there's different sort of measures we can have. But it is true, I do believe that President Trump's instinct, and then sort of a lot of his followers, is against US military engagement, and that's good news.
He's been called a non-interventionist president.
Yeah.
Is that a good description of that?
Well, I think his instincts are there, but the thing is, a non-interventionist president had John Bolton as national security advisor, not anymore, of course, but has Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State. So a lot of sort of people who would be considered neoconservatives, a lot of people from the Bush era who are super interventionists, are part of his government. His maximum pressure policy on Iran is, of course, very interventionist. But for those who are interested in non-interventionism, the good news is President Trump's instincts are sort of towards wanting to make deals with the leadership of Iran, for example, the kind of gestures he's made, saying that, and he did it today as well, right? America has no permanent enemies, and the way he juxtaposed Iran and North Korea and even connected them in his speech, these are signs that he does want to make deals with the leadership of these countries, as opposed to trying to sort of bring regime change there.
Right. Einar Tangen, I want to move now to international trade relations, and of course that's dominated by the trade war that's currently underway between the United States and China. Well, in his speech, the president made a very pointed reference to China. He said that the international trading system had been easily exploited by nations acting in bad faith. Let's listen to what he said.
Not only has China declined to adopt promised reforms, it has embraced an economic model dependent on massive market barriers, heavy state subsidies, currency manipulation, product dumping, forced technology transfers, and the theft of intellectual property, and also trade secrets on a grand scale. The World Trade Organization needs drastic change. The second largest economy in the world should not be permitted to declare itself a developing country in order to game the system at others' expense.
So, Einar Tangen, very harsh words there from the president. How will those words be seen in Beijing?
Well, it's not unexpected. I mean, this is a rehash, as was said earlier, of all his kind of campaign rhetoric. This is, going right back to the base, telling everybody that, the U.S., the most powerful country on earth militarily, politically, and economically, is a victim of the last 30 years of prosperity. I don't think anybody in that room was actually buying it. It is simply, this is the way that Donald Trump is addressing, once again, his base. Making small points about, whether he's naive or not, should not obscure the fact that he is embarked on destroying the post-World War II system of multilateralism, of the idea that instead of going to war, you sit down and hash these things out with your peers. So he wants to go back to a time which was not good. It is not this kind of revisionist, it is not this ideal revisionism that people should adhere to. It's just something that is indescribable when you start comparing it to what Secretary Guterres was saying. What is needed by the world is to come together, and Donald Trump wants to pull it further apart.
Amy Holmes, to Einar Tangen's point that this was a speech that was directed at a domestic audience, specifically his base, he did talk about immigration in this speech at the United Nations. This is what he said.
Today I have a message for those open border activists who cloak themselves in the rhetoric of social justice. Your policies are not just. Your policies are cruel and evil. You are empowering criminal organizations that prey on innocent men, women, and children. You put your own false sense of virtue before the lives, well-being, and countless innocent people. When you undermine border security, you are undermining human rights and human dignity.
So, Amy, what did you make of the fact that the president decided to include immigration in his speech at the United Nations? I mean, is this president now firmly in campaign mode?
Well, illegal immigration is, of course, by its nature, international. It's people moving across borders. But I think it's a really sort of narrow, biased and partisan view to think that this speech was entirely for domestic consumption. It was obviously for foreign consumption as well, as the president laying out his very clear worldview and how he, chooses to pursue what he thinks is in the United States' best interest. I do believe that there was a lot there that was for domestic consumption. He also talked about abortion rights, and he also talked about the Second Amendment, things that you would say or tend to be sort of tangentially related to international issues and tend to be a lot more for voters here in the United States that are motivated by those issues. But I think there was a little bit of both. There was some for a foreign audience and a lot for a domestic audience as well.
Jeff, what did you... Sorry, go ahead.
So I just wanted to say a point that, I don't think there is a contradiction there in the sense that, his domestic base is energized by the kind of intervention he has had in the world affairs, by, the kind of right-wing conservatism. Anti-socialism was a big part of it. Anti-abortion was a big part of it. So there is a consistency there, and he's always had it. The elections getting nearer helps it, but I don't think there's sort of a contradiction there.
All right, let me get Jeff Stacey's view on this. Jeff, why bring up immigration in a forum like this?
Well, that he actually is intending simultaneously for foreign and domestic audiences, but this is a guy who's really under pressure. He's got basically a House of Representatives right here in Washington lapping at his heels, and he lambasted leader after leader after leader. He threw the gauntlet down to China, he went after the Iranians, he went after the Venezuelans. Who did he not mention? He didn't mention Putin. He didn't mention the leader of Ukraine. He didn't mention any Western European leaders by specific name for very clear reasons, because Donald Trump is descending in the global scheme of things and not ascending. This is a person with a vision that does not fit the current context that we're all living in. The interests of the United States, allies, friend and foe, are very different from what he described. So he was basically all alone up there on that rostrum today, and he looked like he felt it. You had basically an audience that was not buying it in any way, shape, or form. And he's got some very sensitive meetings, especially with the Ukrainians, where they have to somehow put the camel through the eye of the needle, tell him what he wants to hear in person, and then have something that they can say to the press that's consistent with that, and at the same time completely do nothing. So you've got all kinds of countries tying themselves in knots because they're having to deal with a leader of the United States that is out of sync with Republicans, with Democrats, with American people who are increasingly looking like they're going to dump him at the next election.
Well, I think we're over-personalizing this, though, a bit. Let's remember that Republican presidents have never been hugely popular at the United Nations. And as far as, President Trump's view of, say, military intervention,
President Obama was very popular at the United Nations.
He was
He
not a
certainly was.
Republican. He was not a Republican.
President Bush was popular at the United Nations.
He was not terribly popular there.
Bush the father, I mean.
And let's remember also that President Trump, he fired John Bolton because he said John Bolton is constantly trying to get us into wars and military intervention. And John Bolton was at loggerheads with Mike Pompeo, who actually advocates more diplomacy rather than this military action. But, going back to the UN and Republicans and conservatives have long had a very conflicted and contested relationship. Donald Trump is the latest iteration.
All right.
Look,
Arash,
Amy, quite frankly, people are waiting for a post-Trump world. And that is quite evident.
I'm sure many of his opponents are.
Of the body to them.
That's no surprise.
The idea that Trump is going to continue, you couldn't even express what the Republican Party would be after Donald Trump goes away. I mean, it does not stand for anything. For you to say that he's a Republican is a bit odd.
This is just a
the fact is he's a Republican name
not
only.
a conversation
His
about the
policies
United
are
Nations
not going
and
anywhere.
foreign policy.
Okay, I want to move on to one of the other specifics in his speech. As Jeff mentioned, he went after Iran. Arash is with me here. Let's listen to what the president said. Let's watch this.
Not only is Iran the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, but Iran's leaders are fueling the tragic wars in both Syria and Yemen. At the same time, the regime is squandering the nation's wealth and future in a fanatical quest for nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. We must never allow this to happen. In response to Iran's recent attack on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, we just imposed the highest level of sanctions on Iran's central bank and sovereign wealth fund. All nations have a duty to act. No responsible government should subsidize Iran's bloodlust. As long as Iran's menacing behavior continues, sanctions will not be lifted. They will be tightened.
So, Arash, what we heard there is not new. We've heard this before. But if you read some of the reports that came out after he made his speech from some analysts, they described this president's comments, especially on Iran, as being moderate. He wasn't as belligerent as one would have expected.
I mean, it shows that the goalposts have shifted.
Right.
But I think the most important thing is that he, after, we've got to remember two events recently. After the expulsion of John Bolton, there was some hope for connections, maybe even a meeting at, between Rouhani and Trump. But then we had the attack on the Saudi oil fields either by the Houthis or by Iran, as Europeans and US are saying. And so that hope that hope went away. So considering the attacks and considering the fact that US and the Europeans attribute them to Iran, the fact that Trump didn't speak of a possibility of, say, military attack, which even Obama spoke of. He obviously spoke of options on the table. I think that's what people are talking about.
There really is a missed opportunity
connect them to North Korea.
I'll get you in a moment.
That connected Iran and North Korea together as, and he said we don't have permanent enemies. So I think that's what people are talking about.
All right, was that you, Jeff, talking to me?
Yes, there was a real missed opportunity here. Basically, the Iranians were certainly guilty of this attack in Saudi Arabia. And it was a bad move. They had in their hands Trump, who was about ready to agree with President Macron of France with a bailout, and they were about to meet President Rouhani and President Trump at this General Assembly. It was quite a move by the Iranians, the wrong move at the wrong time, as they were just about to get on a track, maybe not quite back to the deal, but to something similar to it. Iran blew the chances
frankly,
for this, and the U.S. has done it as well.
Whoever did it is one of those many elements in Iran and other countries that are enemies of possibilities of reconciliation that this region needs so badly. So whether it's IRGC elements, the Houthi leadership, or elements in Iranian leadership, these are people who who benefit from the atmosphere of war that unfortunately goes on in the region.
Well, that's not quite accurate.
To the point that Donald Trump's rhetoric around Iran in his speech, seemed moderate. I think, as the other guests have mentioned, it's important to understand the context, and Iran being accused by the United States and those Western European countries, the UK, France, and Germany, of being behind those attacks on Saudi Arabia. In terms of domestic politics, President President Trump's hands are fairly tied. As I mentioned before, Americans do not want to engage in more military conflict in the Middle East. A poll just came out that only 13% of U.S. voters think that the United States should come to the aid militarily of Saudi Arabia. So a lot of the president's options are tied, and that's what I think was reflected in his speech.
Okay.
Well, he's also basically harmed U.S. national security interests by appearing weak and wavering at a time when, had he been consistent, when the drone was shot down, the Iranians would not have engaged in an attack like this and pushed the ante and gone over red lines.
Okay,
those
Jeff,
statements were not accurate.
Jeff, we've just got a few minutes left, and I really want to address one other big major development, political development here in the United States on Tuesday, late in the afternoon, when the leader of the opposition, Democrat House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, announced that the Democrats will begin an inquiry into impeaching the president.
Right.
Should President Trump be worried?
Well, he should, because this is a formal step, and it leads to a road that he obviously does not want it to go down. All eyes are now going to be on the Senate, and there you have Republicans that feel for the moment that they're safe to stay with him, but as the evidence pours out, and it will, the whistleblower will come forward, the transcripts will eventually get into the hands of Congress and into the public's hands. And if it's as damning as we suspect it is, this president is very much in trouble, and we'll see possibly senators on the Republican side start to shift, and then we could really be for some high drama back here in Washington.
Well,
Amy,
in point of fact, the president has already announced he will be releasing the transcript tomorrow for all of us to read so that we can gather more facts. And he seems to think that the transcript exonerates him. We have no idea if that's true. We'll find out very shortly.
We certainly do have very serious indicators.
Let me finish, please. Let me finish.
1 moment,
but we'll find out very shortly. But as the New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico have all mentioned, that this look into Ukraine and the president's dealings and the former vice president's dealings could be a double-edged sword. And I predict that the biggest winner in all of this could actually be one of Joe Biden's competitors in the Democratic primary, who wants to get to the bottom of this, which could implicate the vice president as well.
Right, Jeff, what is the point of impeachment? Because the Republicans still control the Senate.
Well, the point of impeachment is at some point you have to do your duty as a representative of the country under your own oath. And you have serious evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors here already tangentially, and we'll believe it when we see it. If this White House does not release things that implicate it, so that is not going to happen. And what further, we've got someone who is obfuscating at every point along the way. We had a very damning Mueller report about Russian interference into the election, and within days, the president is on the phone basically doing a quid pro quo that is illegal, that is extortion and bribery by the legal definitions of those terms, certainly impeachable defenses. And as this moves forward, we will see serious pressure on Republican senators to start to bail the president.
Okay, thank you. That's Jeff Stacey talking to us there, and that's where we have to leave it. That's it for this special edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu from the United Nations Rose Garden. Thanks for watching.